Well, thank you. Pleasure to be with you again. And if you haven't already picked this up yet, you can visit our website and get this free DVD of Cosmic Fingerprints. And as I mentioned last night, we'll be talking about hidden treasures in the book of Job. That's the book at the back. I'm going to pick out one theme from that book this morning. And it's a theme that is kind of the heart of what the book of Job is all about. And you'll find this in chapter 12, where Job says to his three friends, ask the beasts, a reference to the land mammals. Ask the beasts and they will teach you. Or the birds in the sky and they will tell you. And so what I'm going to talk about this morning, what exactly do the birds in the sky and the beasts of the field tell us about ourselves, about God, and how we can come into relationship with God? Now, as I mentioned in previous talks, in Genesis 1, it discusses three separate origins of life. Creation Day 1, the origin of life that's purely physical. Creation Day 5, it speaks about life that's not only physical, but also soulish, referring to God creating the birds and the sea mammals. And in Hebrew, it uses this word for these animals. The word is nephesh. And what that word means, creatures endowed with mind, will, and emotions, with a capacity to form emotional relationships with one another. These are creatures that are motivated to serve and nurture their young, sacrifice in order to nurture their young, but they're also endowed with a capacity and a motivation to serve or please human beings. And then at the beginning of Creation Day 6, God creates three specialized kinds of land mammals, the category of land mammals that are most important for launching and sustaining human civilization. And it mentions the short-legged animals, a reference to the rodents. It mentions the long-legged land animals that are easy to tame, a reference to those creatures we use on the farms, and a reference to long-legged land animals that are difficult to tame but make excellent household pets and companions. Basically a reference to the herbivores and the carnivores that have long legs. Now, all of this is developed in far more detail in the book of Job. And it's in Job 38 and 39 that expands on the message of God creating these soulish animals, each one to serve and please human beings in its own particular way. Now, the soulish animals were designed to serve and please humans before humans even existed. In other words, these weren't creatures that evolved to meet our needs. They already were endowed with that capacity before we human beings showed up. That means their distinct designs for servicing humanity cannot be the product of evolution. They must be the product of purposeful design. But Charles Darwin in particular did not believe this. And this is kind of the heart of his book that's been ignored until just the past few years by the scientific community. But if you read his book, Descent of Man, published in 1871, he said that the differences between human and non-human minds is one of degree and not of kind. In other words, he admitted that we're smarter than the animals, but only by degree. We're not in any way endowed with a mind that's distinct from that of human beings. And as proof for that in his book, he pointed out, quote, there is a much wider interval in the mental power between one of the lowest fishes and one of the higher apes than between an ape and a man. And therefore, he said, we're just simply an evolved animal. But if you go back to Genesis 1, you can see the fallacy in Charles Darwin's point. Because what Genesis 1 tells us, the fish do not have minds. So of course, the ape is more closely related to us than the fish, because after all, the ape has a mind, we have a mind, the fish has no mind at all. Now, this had been ignored in the sense that if you read Charles Darwin's books, he was always encouraging the scientific community to put his model to the test. And he said, this is an area where you can see whether I'm right or I'm wrong. Now, there's other places where the scientific community endeavored to test Darwin's ideas, but this one was literally ignored until 4 years ago. And so all the attention was on the life forms that are purely physical, and not the life forms that are physical and soulish. And the first paper published that began to check or test Darwin's concept was in a paper titled, "Can Evolution Explain How Minds Work?" And they began their paper, Johann Bullius and Clive Wynne, with a statement. Like Darwin, quote, biologists have tended to assume that species with shared ancestry will have similar cognitive abilities. And when they mean by shared ancestry, it's simply similar physical appearance. So the animals that are physically most similar to one in appearance, he would argue, would have similar cognitive abilities, similar abilities of the mind. And this is why evolutionary biologists have presumed that the chimpanzee has a mind that's most closely related to the human mind. But what they point out, Bullius and Wynne in their paper, is that when they actually do experiments with animals, they have discovered the chimpanzee is not the smartest of the non-human animals. In fact, they research in their paper, they list several different species that are considerably more intellectual than the chimpanzee. And the one at the very top of the list is a bird. It's a raven. Raven, according to their research, has by far the greatest intellectual capabilities of any non-human animal. And what they specifically talk about in their research paper is how a chimpanzee can use tools. In fact, if you watch chimpanzees in the wild, they will pick up a rock and they'll use that rock to crack nuts to get the meat out of the nuts. But what they found is that a raven is able to take a tool and use that tool to recover a completely different tool and use that tool to get a food treat with no human training. Now, in the experiment, they said, let's see if we can get the chimpanzee to take a tool, to use a different tool to get a food treat. It literally takes years of human training with that chimp before it's able to do it, and the raven does it automatically. Now, my own father had a pet raven when he was in his teenage years. And my father became a machinist and an engineer. And so what he did with his pet raven is he built a cage for it, and he put a lock on the cage. But then he put in some little shaves of steel inside the thing, and what he did is he watched the raven pick the lock. And the raven would jump out of the cage and kind of make a big display. And then my father would take that lock off and put a completely different lock on, and the raven voluntarily would jump back into the cave. My dad would lock the cave, and then he would pick the lock again. So my father said, I wonder if this, you can see why I was born a scientist. My father kind of had that characteristic too. What he did next is he went to his machine shop and he built these little three-dimensional, I think you just see these, we have them for children, where you have all these little blocks and inside there's like a little ball. Well, he did that for the raven and built about a dozen of these different three-dimensional puzzles. And what he noticed was the raven would ignore the puzzle unless my dad was watching him. If my dad was watching him, then he would solve the puzzle and wait for my dad to give him another puzzle that he would solve. And what this demonstrates is that these soulish animals show their greatest capabilities when they're emotionally bonded to a human being. And that's the first lesson we get from the soulish animals. Notice that when they bond to a higher being is when their greatest capabilities are released. Well, likewise, it's with us. When we're bonded to a higher being, namely God the Creator, this is when our greatest capabilities are manifested to the world. So this is a lesson we can learn from these soulish animals. Now, that led to several other research papers being published. And 3 other biologists published a paper dealing with is the capability of the human mind differing by not just degree, but fundamentally by kind. And this is what they said. There's a significant discontinuity in the degree to which human and non-human animals are able to approximate the higher order systematic relational capabilities of a physical symbol system. You've got to write like this in order to get published in behavior and brain science. But what they're basically saying is that we humans are designed, we're given minds that are able to respond to symbols whereas the non-human animals are not able to do that. And as an example, no non-human animal can appreciate the meaning, the beauty, and the elegance of these Higgs equations. I mean, have you ever seen anything more gorgeous than these equations? And remember the first talk I gave you, I made the point that of all the scientists, mathematicians are the ones where you find the highest degree of belief in God and an afterlife. And it's because of equations that so many of them believe in God. Because you look at equations of mathematics that describe the physical world, mathematicians stand in awe of these equations, of how elegantly and beautifully they describe physical reality around us. And this is what's drawing them to God. In fact, I know of a theologian, Thomas Torrance, who used to give lectures to atheist physicists and mathematicians. And it was a 20-minute lecture on the beauty principle of mathematics. And he says, I can't tell you how many mathematicians and physicists have led to the Lord. Well, it's not just the Higgs equations where animals struggle. Maybe a few of you struggle with it too. But the truth is that no animal can read the first page of the first Fun with Dick and Jane reader. I don't know whether they use this in Australia, but in Canada, this is kind of what happens the first day of grade 1. And humans can deal with that, but not any animal. In fact, what these three authors pointed out is there's no non-human animal can understand the meaning of any of these symbols. No matter how much you train them, they're not going to be able to figure out what a stop sign is and what to do when they see a stop sign. And they conclude in their paper, we show that this symbol relational discontinuity pervades nearly every domain of cognition, proving that the human mind is distinct in kind, not just in degree, which means our mind is not the product of evolution. It's the product of special creation. Now, this led to a number of researches being done by biologists on the east coast of the United States. And what they were looking at was the question, are humans the only moral animals? I mean, again, from a Darwinian perspective, we got our morality by evolution for the creatures. But no one had bothered to do the experiments. And so there was a university in Boston where they began to do an experiment on what's called the mean dog syndrome. And we've all run into that, where there's certain dogs you run into and they're just mean. Well, what they discovered in their research is that dogs, like all carnivores, will defend themselves against real or perceived attacks. So, for example, if a dog has been consistently abused by red-headed 8-year-old boys, every time the dog sees a red-headed 8-year-old boy, they're going to respond in self-defense. The other thing is that when dogs are bonded to a human owner, dogs are protective of their owner's personal safety and turf and will aggressively respond to perceived threats to either. Now, God designed dogs to especially form strong emotional bonds with us. This is why we often choose dogs for pets, because they have that incredible capability of forming a very strong emotional bond with us. And it's that emotional bond that motivates that dog to do whatever it can to make its owner happy. I mean, of all the pets you can have, I don't know of any other species that works harder at making you happy. And this really explains the mean dog syndrome. A dog strongly bonded to a malicious human and its desire to please that human will manifest vicious behavior. I mean, as a minister of evangelism in our church in the United States, I would train people on how to go door to door and talk to them about the Christian faith. But it's one thing you can know about who you're going to meet at the door is the behavior of the pets. The pets are extremely vicious and mean, then watch out for the owner. But if the pets are very friendly and tender, then you're probably going to have a good encounter. Now, you've probably all heard of the guilty look on dogs, and this is what's caused many people to think that dogs like us are moral beings. I mean, this is our pet dog, okay? He had just destroyed some article of clothing, and look at the look he takes on. Or consider the shoe that he has destroyed, okay? So, it goes on. Now, what happened at a university in Boston is that they began to see, is this really an indication that dogs are moral like we are? Well, of all the nephesh creatures, dogs possess the greatest capacity to recognize our human facial expressions and to exhibit facial expressions. You know, dogs don't normally smile, but if they figure out that we like them to smile, they will smile. So they will adopt these facial expressions. And it was at Barnard College in Boston where they did experiments that showed that a dog's guilty look has nothing to do with the dog's misdeed or behavior. Rather, it has everything to do with the look on the owner's face. And so that's what they did. They had the dog do something that was actually pleasing to the owner, but they had the owner take on a scolding look, and immediately they got the guilty look. Or if the dog did something bad in the eyes of the human owner, but the owner was pleased, no guilty look. It's all with respect to trying to please the owner, and therefore they concluded that sin and morality is unique to human beings. We're the only species that responds to morality, the only species that experiences guilt, the only species that is concerned about right and wrong. So humans are the only animals that respond to morality. Now, that shows that we are much more than just animals. And the next research that was done in the past few years was to look at YouTube. YouTube, believe it or not, has become a scientific research database. Why? Because on YouTube, there's now hundreds of thousands of video clips of animal behavior. So as a team at University of California, San Diego, where a couple of professors there, that's where my son got his degree, but several professors there got a team of graduate students together to spend thousands of hours watching YouTube video clips. I mean, education's changed. But they wound up writing a research paper on this particular creature, probably the most famous animal on YouTube, Snowball. Maybe some of you have seen the video clips of a Snowball. All right, I'm going to actually show you a video clip of Snowball. Okay, and give you some background. Snowball is a cockatoo that was bonded to a teenage girl. And this teenage girl was really excited about a music group called the Backstreet Boys. And what happened is that this bird, in order to make this teenage girl happy, would show pleasure and happiness whenever the Backstreet Boys are being played. And for this teenage girl, there was one song in particular, the Backstreet Boys, that she really liked. And what I'm going to show you is a video clip of what Snowball does when he hears the Backstreet Boys song, Everybody. Here goes. All right. Well, what this experiment was demonstrating is how this cockatoo was putting everything it possibly could into showing this teenage girl how pleased he was with that particular song, just like she was. And what they noticed is that if you played the music more slowly, then a Snowball would adjust the beat. So she would dance more slowly, or if it speeded up, would dance more rapidly, because the suspicion of the researchers was this bird has been trained over several years to do it just this way. But they discovered it made no difference, in the sense that it would dance to many different songs, as long as it was the Backstreet Boys. And no matter what the tempo was, it would keep pace with the tempo. But in particular, they demonstrated with, say, parrots. Now, parrots can't do the kick step, but parrots can swing their heads like cockatoos can't. And what they're able to demonstrate is that these birds are literally putting everything they physically can into showing their human owner how excited they are about their favorite music. And then the research team went into the wild, because one of the things you know about parrots is that they have courtship songs. And so, like the female will sing a courtship song to the male. And they wanted to see if the males would dance to the courtship songs of these wild female parrots. And what they discovered is they won't. Parrots haven't been shown to dance to a beat in the wild, even to the songs of their courtship displays. They only do it when they're bonded to a human being. So again, this is demonstrating that the full potential of these animals is only manifested when they're emotionally bonded to a higher being. Again, underlying the lesson, that's also true of us human beings. Our full potential is only released when we're bonded emotionally to a higher being. Now, having read all this in the scientific literature, I realized, I could have published this 40 years ago, because I had a pet bird when I was in my late teenage years and early 20s. And Pedro bonded to me more so than the other members of the family, and just loved to sit on my shoulder. And he quickly discovered I didn't like him dirtying my shirts. So he potty trained himself. I didn't train him. What he did is he would tug on my earlobe, and that was a signal he needed to go. And so I put him on one of his tree perches we had all over the house. And then he would come back on my shoulder. That way he could spend maximum time on my shoulder throughout the day. And the other thing he would do is early in the morning, he would sit on my shoulder and then check my face out to see if I missed a whisker when I was shaving. And if I did, he would pick it off. So, and after breakfast, he would check my teeth to see if there's anything left there. I mean, a lot of you have birds that have done that. I mean, they'll stick their head right in your mouth at the back molar. So, but the thing I think annoyed my parents the most about Pedro was the fact that, we would play bridge. And Pedro would sit in my hand while we're playing some bridge. And every time I won a hand, Pedro would do a victory dance on my shoulder and would sing a little song. I remember my mother's comment saying, it's bad enough to lose to her son at bridge, but his bird gloats. So, but just like with Snowball, he would dance to my favorite music. Now, my favorite music at that time was Beethoven. And probably the piece I liked the most was the Brandenburg Third Concerto. And so whenever that was playing, he would do the same thing as Snowball, put everything he physically could into showing me how much he enjoyed that particular piece of music. Now, he was not at all bonded to my two sisters. And when they were kind of into a certain brand of rock music, and whenever they played that rock music, he would go into a screeching tantrum until they turned it off. And my mother's comment was, Hugh, your bird is a music snob. Well, it wasn't that my bird was a music snob, rather he was emotionally bonded to me and not to my sisters. And so he was showing his displeasure at them and his pleasure at me by dancing to the music in a certain way. So, but once again, it's something I observed, that Pedro would put everything it physically could, but only at that one moment. Now, you go into Job 38 and 39, it shows how certain soulish animals were crucial for the launching of human civilization. And to me, this passage in Job really is a sign that we in the 21st century lack appropriate humility. We think we built all these cities ourselves. We did it through our own power. What we see in the book of Job is we would have gotten nowhere if God hadn't first created these animals and designed them in a certain way to assist us in launching and sustaining civilization. And today, with all the technology we have, we've kind of lost sight of the fact that what brought us to this particular point. And what you see in Job 38 and 39 is a top 10 list, basically pointing out the 10 most significant soulish animals that God created to serve us and to please us. And here are the top 10. The lion, the raven, the goat, the deer, the donkey, the ox, the ostrich, the horse, the hawk, the eagle. And as I read this in Job several years ago, I said, why these 10 and not others? So this is what motivated me to do a study. And I discovered, for example, that one of the features of cows is that they've been designed to be able to do very heavy farm labor like no other animal. So for example, there's one breed of cow that's capable of lifting 9,000 pounds with its neck muscles alone. No other creature is capable of doing that. But one of the things they discovered in studying cows is how much they enjoy doing heavy labor for a human being they're bonded to. Now, I kind of wish my sons were designed that way. But it's a cow that really loves doing. Now, today, we don't use cows for heavy farm labor. And in one sense, I think we're discouraging the cows. We use them for meat and for milk, but really they were designed to perform heavy farm labor. And this is where they get their real fulfillment. Each of these creatures was created with a unique soulishness to serve and please human beings in a distinct way. Each fulfilled a crucial role in launching and sustaining civilization, and each one challenges the evolutionary paradigm. And if you get the book there at the back, what I do is I show you how each one of these top 10 played a crucial role in launching human civilization, but amazingly fulfills a totally different role when we have high-tech global civilization. Now, I'll give you one quick example. The goat is on the list because it's the easiest animal to tame of all. I mean, I've been out in the wilds of Canada, and you can run into a wild goat, and within 1 minute, that animal is tamed. And it was because of goats that humans were able to tame other animals. They're kind of a pathway animal, because a goat is an all-purpose agricultural animal. I mean, they provide you with wool, they provide you with leather, with meat and milk. You can take the horns and make musical instruments out of them. But the goat is not the best meat-bearing animal, it's not the best wool-bearing animal, but it paved the way for us to domesticate other animals that were slightly more difficult to tame. Now, today, we don't need goats for any of those purposes. But we've discovered in certain parts of the world, they're really the only animal that can take care of certain modern ills. I live in Southern California, and we're always being plagued by these fires that go through the chaparral. And so the standard technique was to build fire breaks, about 50-foot wide fire breaks with bulldozers. But the bulldozers can only go up about a 50-degree slope, and bulldozers leave behind vegetation. They've now discovered, forget the bulldozers, we're going to bring in a herd of goats. And you can actually train the goats to eat every possible piece of vegetation in a 60-foot wide swath. I mean, they will eat everything if you train them to eat everything. They love doing that for you. And they can go up an 80-degree slope, which a bulldozer can't do. So now we're using goats to control fires. And I notice here in Tasmania, you've got blackberries. We have a blackberry problem in British Columbia, in the sense that, by the way, they were imported from Asia. They're Himalayan blackberries, and if you give them a chance, they take over everything. And they form this impenetrable hedge of thorns. And it's such that it impedes animals in their migration routes. And so a problem in British Columbia, how do we get rid of these Himalayan blackberries? And they discovered that goats are the only way to do it. You can train goats to grab the leaves off of the blackberries, and the vine dies. But if you know anything about blackberries, it pops right back up. But what they discovered is if a goat strips the leaves off of the blackberry, every single leaf, and does that 6 times over, the blackberry dies permanently. It will not come back. So this is how they're controlling that particular problem. But as I'm mentioning here, these top 10 animals provide us with some of the most powerful arguments against the evolutionary paradigm. And probably the 2 best examples would be the donkey and the horse. Because evolutionists have looked at the donkey and the horse and said, this proves the Darwinian evolutionary paradigm. Look how closely they're related to one another. They must have a recent common ancestor. And as evidence, they say you can take a donkey and cross it with a horse and get a mule. Of course, mules won't reproduce after their own kind. But the problem here is these evolutionists have only looked at the physical features of the donkey and the horse. These are soulish animals. They have mind, will, and emotions. And they've not yet examined that, although now researchers are doing that very thing. And what they discovered is that when a donkey is bonded to a human being, it behaves radically differently from a horse that's bonded to a human being. And so they may be similar physically, but they're not at all similar in terms of their mind, will, and emotions. So for example, what you discover with a donkey, it tells us in the book of Job, chapter 39, that the donkey is easy to domesticate, but if for some reason you lose your donkey and it's out there in the wild, don't worry. The donkey can very easily revert from being domesticated to taking care of itself in the wild. That doesn't work with horses. If you have a horse that's been domesticated and you lose your horse and it's got to fend for itself in the wild, chances are it won't make it. And if it does make it, it won't rebond to you. And what we see in the book of Job is that if you lose your donkey and 3 months, 4 months, 6 months later you find your wild donkey, that wild donkey will leave its wild lifestyle and bond back to you. And it's capable of doing that multiple times. A horse has no capacity to do that. Only donkeys can do that. Now, donkeys are transportation animals as long as you're not too tall. I mean, I think you'd have trouble being on a donkey because your feet would drag on the ground. You just kind of lift your feet up. But the thing about donkeys is how strongly motivated they are to keep their human owner away from danger. So for example, if you're in snake territory, the donkey will watch out for that and kind of back away, making sure that you're not bothered by the dangers that are out there. Or if there's some predator out there, big predator, the donkey will be worried that and take you in a different direction. And for that reason, donkeys are not noted to be very good animals for military exploits. Because when you're riding a donkey into battle, as soon as a donkey sees arrows coming its way, it heads in the opposite direction. So it's going to do everything to keep you away from danger, which is why in the United States we use donkeys to take tourists down the Grand Canyon. I mean, I've been down some of those Grand Canyon trails. I mean, you're on a trail this wide, you look over and it's a 2,000-foot drop. And that can be a little bit unnerving. But if you're on a donkey, don't worry. That donkey is so motivated to make sure you will not fall off that you're totally secure. By the way, I was telling a story here about Fuzz Rana. Fuzz, I think, was here a few years back. And Fuzz took one of these donkeys down the Grand Canyon. And Amy Rana, his wife, said, "I've never heard Fuzz pray so much." Every time he went around the bend, he was saying a prayer because he was terrified, and then finally recognized, I'm totally safe. This donkey's not going to let anything happen to me. And, very sure-footed. So you don't have to worry. It can go places you can't go. What about the horse? The horse is really the ideal transportation animal. It's high enough off the ground that even your pastor here is not going to drag his feet. But it's not so high off the ground like a camel that if you fall off, you might find yourself in the hospital. So it's really the ideal animal in terms of its size for transporting human beings on its back. Moreover, unlike the donkey, you can take a fair load. I mean, I can tell you another story about Fuzz. They told him, you can't go down the Grand Canyon until you get your body weight under 200 pounds. So he got it down to about 190 because he wanted to take some luggage with him too. But with a horse, that's not a problem. You can take a big human being plus all their gear, and the horse is strong enough to be able to handle that. Now, one of the characteristics of horses in terms of their mind, will, and emotions is their loyalty and their obedience. Horses are probably at the top of the list of the nefesh animals and just how loyal they can be to their human owner. A horse will sacrifice its own health to serve the needs of its human being. It will willingly sacrifice its life in order to preserve the life of its human owner, which is why they've been favored for things like battle. And that means another thing. Unlike donkeys, horses love adventure, they love danger, they love challenge. And that's what it tells us in the book of Job, that when they hear the cry of battle, they can't wait to go into battle with its human owner. Now, they won't go alone, but if they're with a human being, they will charge into battle no matter what the danger is and do whatever they can as that human owner rides it into battle to make sure that its owner is able to fulfill its mission and do everything it can to protect that owner's life. Well, I think you get the point. If you look at the horse and you look at the donkey and how they relate to a human being they're bonded to, You can't find two animals that are more different. Therefore, how can they possibly be related by natural ascent to a common ancestor? They must have been specially created by their Creator to have this particular manifestation. And notice too, from the Creator's perspective, the Creator is going to want the donkey and the horse to have similar physical features, because after all, they're both designed to be transportation creatures for animals. But we human beings sometimes need an animal that will keep us safe and out of danger and is sure-footed. Other times we need an animal that's not afraid of danger, risk, or adventure. Well, back to what Job said in chapter 12. Ask the beasts and they'll teach you, or the birds of the air and they will tell you. Now, I've traveled to all the continents except Antarctica, spoken around the world, debated atheists around the world. But one of the things I've noticed is the atheists I've debated, they all live in cities. And only in cities where little contact with soulish animals exists does atheism thrive. It's really only been in the latter part of the 20th century and the 21st century where we've seen this rise of atheism. And it's actually correlated with the rise of urbanization. I mean, 70 years ago, most of the world's population did not live in cities. Today, 3/4 of the world's population live in cities. And where do you find the atheists? In densely populated urban centers, where they're cut off from contact with these birds and mammals that Job speaks about. And as they were created to serve and please us, so we were created to serve and please God. As their full potential is only achieved when they're related to us, a higher species, likewise our full potential is only released when we are bonded to God Himself. Now, as I presented this in front of audiences that are not Christians, they will say, you know, I don't see this. What I see is these birds and mammals running away from us instead of towards us. You're claiming that they actually are motivated to serve and please us. Why do they run away? Well, Job explains this. He says, as sin damages our relationship with the soulish animals and causes them to run away, so also sin destroys our relationship with God and causes us to pretend that He doesn't exist or to run away from Him. So as we look at the behavior of these animals and how they're afraid of us because of the abuse they experience at our hand, it teaches us a very important lesson about how we've offended God, and in that offense, instead of coming to Him, we run away from Him or pretend He doesn't exist. Now, as you start in Job 38, there's a message there that goes all the way through to the very end of the book of Job, Job 42. God is basically trying to communicate to Job and his friends the most important lesson of all that we can gain from these soulish animals. And what he points out to them is that you have been successful in taming all these animals. But notice that some are more difficult to tame than others. As I mentioned already, you can tame a wild goat in about 60 seconds. Now, trying to tame a wild adult lion, that can't be done in 60 seconds. It can be done, but you're looking at probably a year or two to tame an adult, like with a wolf. I've had friends who've been able to tame a wild adult wolf, but it took over a year for that to be done. Now, if you start with, say, a baby cub lion that's just been born, then you have an easier time. But what God is pointing out in Job 38 through to 42 is that some of these soulish animals are extraordinarily difficult to tame. And in Job 40 and 41, he says, let me tell you about the two that are the most difficult to tame of all, the behemoth and the leviathan. Now, some people look at those texts and think that it's talking about dinosaurs. But dinosaurs are not soulish animals. These are soulish animals, and they're animals that Job and his friends were familiar with. And when you read Job 40 and 41, it's describing the characteristics of these animals, but it's also giving you figures of speech that describe how you feel when you have a close encounter with these animals. So for an example, when it says of the leviathan that it breathes fire and smoke out of its mouth, what it's communicating there is that if you're really close to the leviathan and you've got a stick in your hand to defend yourself, that creature may as well be breathing fire and smoke out of its mouth for all the good that stick is going to do to defend yourself. When it says when it's got plates of steel on its belly, Again, it's not saying it's got literal plates of steel. It says that's how you're going to feel if you've got a rock in your hand and that creature's just 10 feet away from you. And how do you know that? Count how many times you see the words like and as in the English translation. That's always a clue you're getting a figure of speech. So it says, look at the behemoth and look at the leviathan, the two most difficult to tame nephesh creatures. Now, when we human beings had intimate contact with the birds and mammals, I noticed that all the commentaries and lexicons on the Bible agreed that the leviathan was a crocodile and the behemoth was a hippopotamus. It was only in the 20th century when you began to see some confusion in the lexicons, mainly because by then we had become urbanized. We humans have successfully tamed all the nephesh creatures, some with great difficulty. So for example, you can tame a hippopotamus, but you can only tame a hippopotamus if that hippopotamus is given to you when the mother dies immediately upon childbirth. And that's happened a few times, where the mother hippopotamus gives birth to the baby, but dies in the process, and a human being takes that newborn hippo, and if you're willing to spend about an hour a day with that hippo throughout its entire life, that hippo will be tamed and will do your bidding and will actually show affection towards you. Now, the crocodile is even more difficult. By the way, there are 2 or 3 species of reptiles that will nurture their young. Crocodiles are in that category. They will care for their young. And they can be tamed. But same thing, you've got to take the crocodile from the time it comes out of its egg, and now you're looking at about 2 hours a day of daily contact, and you have to handle that crocodile. And by the time it's an adult, it will do your bidding and show affection towards you. However, I'll tell you this, if you miss a day, you're in trouble. That's how difficult it is to tame. And this is where the book of Job ends. God says to Job and his friends, you've been able to tame all these animals. Some are very difficult to tame, but notice this, it takes a higher being to tame these animals. And there's one soulish animal you can never tame. You can never tame your fellow man. No human being is capable of bringing humility to a proud human being. That's something God can only do. And unless we go to God for the humility we need, then we'll not be tamed by him. So as it takes a higher being to tame these soulish animals, so also it takes a higher being to tame a human being. Which kind of leaves us with a question. Job had the humility to submit to his Creator and be tamed by him. That was the difference between Job and his 3 friends. He had that humility, and he knew he had to go to God to gain the greater humility that he needed. He had that humility. How about the rest of us? Thank you.